In room 2141, Chief Justice John Roberts sat cloaked in 40 years of power. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett leaned in, armed with two folders and the voices of 10,000 people. The battleground was one word the court feared most: ethics. One leaked email, one signed document, and the marble walls began to crack. But what happens when the nation's highest judge is cornered by a freshman congresswoman who refuses to kneel? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The theme was clear from the start. Justice doesn't belong to the powerful, it belongs to the people. Room 2141 glared under harsh white lights, sterile and cold. At the center sat Chief Justice John Roberts, poised in an immaculate navy suit, exuding control. Cameras locked onto him. Senators relaxed. Everyone expected another safe hearing. Tough questions, smooth deflections, nothing would touch him. Then Jasmine Crockett entered. Her steps were firm, her eyes sharp, her silence louder than the room itself. She didn't look around. She didn't smile. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to confront. Whispers flew. Too young. Too bold. She'll crumble. Roberts watched her like a man watching a storm he didn't believe in. She sat, leaned in, and the room changed. The silence wasn't respectful. It was loaded. No one moved. No one breathed. This wasn't routine anymore. This was a collision waiting to happen. Jasmine Crockett hadn't thrown a punch, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't even finished her first line of questioning, but something in her stillness, in the way her fingers touched the folder, in the way her eyes never once drifted from her target, made the entire room hold its breath like prey, sensing a predator. She spoke with precision, no stutter, no stalling. "Chief Justice," she said evenly, "you've publicly stated that the court follows a strict ethical standard, even without a formal code. Is that correct?" Her words were smooth, but beneath them, coiled like wire, was an unspoken challenge. "Let's see if you'll lie while the cameras roll." It wasn't a question, it was bait. Roberts didn't blink. He shifted in his chair like a king adjusting the throne. The corners of his mouth curled upward into a smirk carved from decades of unchecked power. "That is correct, Congresswoman," he answered, calm and clean, already preparing his next move. And then he struck. "Though I imagine ethics may look different in a Texas courtroom." The jab landed, quiet but venomous. Gasps weren't heard, but they were felt, and he didn't stop there. "Ms. Crockett, perhaps a few years of practice in Texas led you to believe you understand the law the way we do." That line didn't just insult her background, it spit on it. He wasn't debating, he was degrading. He was telling her in front of the entire nation that she didn't belong at the same table, that her experience in crowded, underfunded courtrooms, fighting for the voiceless, somehow made her less than the men in robes on marble benches. The effect was immediate. Heads turned, brows lifted. One aide's pen froze mid-sentence. The cameras, for once, didn't know where to look: at the smirking titan of American justice, or at the woman he just tried to humiliate on national record. Jasmine didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't breathe wrong. She didn't give him the dignity of a reaction. Instead, she calmly turned a page. Slow, cold, surgical. That movement alone sent a shiver down the room's spine. And then, just barely, she smiled. Not the kind of smile you give in politics. Not for the press, not for the public. This was the kind of smile you give when your opponent just handed you the match and doesn't even realize you're holding gasoline. She raised her eyes and met his gaze, silent as death, steady as iron. And without saying a word, her expression said everything. "You just made the worst mistake of your career." That's when the room finally felt it. This wasn't a hearing. This wasn't theater. This wasn't another meaningless back and forth for the history books. This was a trap, and John Roberts, Chief Justice of the United States, had just walked into it with a smile on his face. And Jasmine, she hadn't even drawn her weapon yet. And just when the room thought it had seen the worst of Roberts' arrogance, he escalated. Not with law, not with logic, but with something far uglier: calculated humiliation. He didn't raise his voice, but every word landed like a slap. "Let's be honest," he said, straightening his posture as if ready to deliver a verdict. "Representing criminals in local Texas courts isn't exactly a shining legal career." The room froze. The sentence was soaked in disdain, not just for her resume, but for the people she had defended. Poor, voiceless, forgotten. He wasn't attacking her skill. He was attacking her worth. "That might play well back home," he added with a casual shrug. "But here, it barely qualifies you to question this bench, let alone understand it." The message was blistering. "You're small. You're out of place. You should know better." He paused, not to reflect, but to twist the knife deeper. He turned slightly, scanning the room like a teacher scolding a misbehaving student in front of the class. Then, with chilling smugness, he dropped the next blow. "And now a young woman believes she can lecture the Supreme Court?" It wasn't a question. It was theater. Deliberate, sharp, designed to draw blood. A few senators exchanged glances. One leaned back with a dry chuckle. The subtext was clear. "Sit down, little girl. The grown-ups are talking." But Roberts wasn't done. He leaned forward, voice low but firm, cutting through the air like cold steel. "We're not here to play identity politics." The room shifted. Some jaws clenched. Others smirked. But Roberts didn't flinch. "Some of us are here to interpret the Constitution, not weaponize diversity." The line struck like a bullet in slow motion. It wasn't just sexist. It wasn't just condescending. It was racial, personal. He didn't say the words outright, but he didn't need to. He made it clear. Your gender, your skin, your history, they don't belong here. A pause, heavy, loaded, thick with the weight of a system that had spoken this way in shadows for generations, now laid bare in a single televised moment. Around the chamber, some faces tightened. One aide stopped typing. Another senator gave a short, uncomfortable cough. Cameras adjusted, lenses zooming in. It was no longer just a hearing. It was an execution attempt. Roberts wasn't defending the court. He was trying to silence her. Not with argument, but with erasure. But Jasmine Crockett didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't even flinch. She let the moment sit. Then slowly she looked up from her folder, eyes locked, spine unshaken, voice like the snap of tempered steel. "You can diminish me all you want," she said, calm as thunder just before the storm. "But you can't diminish the truth." It was a direct hit, but not explosive, surgical. A clean, perfect incision into every layer of condescension he'd tried to wrap around her. And as those words hung in the air, everything else, smirks, titles, robes, legacy, started to look very, very small. This wasn't the moment she was broken. This was the moment the courtroom broke open. And just when Roberts thought the worst had passed, when her calm reply seemed like restraint, Jasmine struck. Not with emotion, with evidence. She reached into the folder like it was muscle memory, not a performance. Her fingers didn't fumble. Her voice didn't tremble. She pulled out a single page and slid it forward, slowly, like she was laying a trap that had already been set. "Let's talk precedent," she said, clear and crisp. There was no anger in her tone, just precision, cold, factual, and impossible to run from. "Dalton versus Mason County, Fifth Circuit, Ikebindakus." She glanced at Roberts, not seeking permission, but daring him to interrupt. He didn't. "The judge in that case failed to recuse himself," she continued, her eyes scanning the room, "even though he only had indirect financial ties to one of the law firms involved." Her pause was intentional. The ruling made it clear. The appearance of impropriety alone was enough to disqualify him. She let that last sentence land, not like a punch, but like a pin being pulled from a grenade. Then, without shifting tone, without blinking, she reached for the next document. "Now let's look at Macon versus Delta Rail." Another page, another trap. "A case from last year," she said, voice steady, but now laced with something colder, righteous certainty. Justice Harlan sat on it. He issued a ruling in favor of Delta Rail, while his longtime friend and campaign backer held a sizable stake in that company. Her eyes lifted slowly from the page and locked onto Roberts. No recusal, no explanation, just a 5-4 decision that benefited his inner circle. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was stunned. No one laughed this time. No one dared. One senator slowly lowered the pen in his hand. A journalist in the back cursed under his breath and started typing, like he was afraid he'd forget what he just heard. The cameras pivoted, not toward Roberts, but toward Jasmine. Because in a room full of legacy and law degrees, she had just introduced the one thing no robe could deflect, a precedent too clear to dismiss. And Roberts moved. It was subtle, but everyone saw it. His fingers tugged at his cuff, his brow furrowed. His body leaned back just an inch too far, like someone trying not to look like they were retreating while clearly retreating. The composed mask cracked, not in words but in muscle. And that was enough. For the first time that day, Chief Justice John Roberts wasn't the one in control. He wasn't on offense. He wasn't even defending a position. He was defending himself. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. She sat still, eyes unblinking, like a hunter who knew exactly where to shoot and had just hit the mark. This wasn't drama. This was discipline. And it was devastating. And just when it seemed Roberts might regain his footing, Jasmine pulled the floor out from beneath him. She didn't quote law. She didn't flash documents. She did something far more dangerous. She told a story. Jasmine inhaled slowly and let her voice drop, not in weakness, but in weight. "There's a woman in my district," she said, her tone almost quiet, but cutting through the air like a scalpel through silk. "Her name is Carla Jennings." The name hit with the force of something real, something no robe, no bench, no title could dismiss. "She's a single mother," Jasmine continued, her eyes steady. "Raised 2 kids while working nights at St. Augustine Memorial in Houston. 21 years. Overnight shifts. No complaints. No shortcuts. Just blood, sweat, and barely enough sleep to survive between paychecks." She paused, not for drama, but for reverence. She wasn't embellishing. She was honoring. "She applied for federal financial aid last year," Jasmine said, her voice tightening slightly, just enough for the room to feel the grip in her chest. Her son had gotten into University of Texas at Austin, first in the family to make it. It should have been a proud day. Jasmine looked directly at Roberts now. But a clerical error flagged her tax records. The system thought she owed back taxes. She didn't. It was a glitch, a data input error. No fault of her own. She appealed, Jasmine said. She called. She wrote letters. She submitted everything they asked for. Twice. Her jaw clenched slightly, just enough for the camera to catch it. And she was denied. Roberts blinked. Just once. Jasmine didn't stop. She was told in legal language too cold to bleed that she was ineligible due to conflicting records. Jasmine shook her head slowly. And just like that, her son's financial aid evaporated. Because of a form. Because of a box someone else checked wrong. She leaned forward slightly. He never enrolled. She couldn't afford it. After 20 years of giving everything to a system that demanded her silence, her strength, and her spine, she was left with nothing. A hush fell over the room. Even those who had written Jasmine off earlier were now leaning forward. Some folded their arms, not to resist, but to hold themselves together. The name Carla Jennings was no longer a line of testimony. It was a mirror, and some didn't like what they saw in it, but Jasmine wasn't done. And while Carla Jennings was being buried under red tape, she said slowly, a billionaire real estate investor, whose name I won't say here, but whose donations to Justice Harlan's personal foundation are a matter of public record, filed a lawsuit against a zoning board that denied him a high-rise permit in a residential district. She raised her eyebrows just slightly. The court accepted the case in under 2 months. It was expedited, heard, argued, ruled. Her voice flattened into something razor-sharp. And he won. A wave of discomfort passed through the chamber. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but her presence did. I'm not here to accuse, she said. I'm here to compare. And the comparison is brutal. She tapped her index finger on the desk once, precisely. Carla, a single mother, no lobbyists, no inside calls, no legal team. Another tap. And him, with access, with influence, with friendships on the bench. She looked directly at Roberts again. You see, that's what people in my district talk about. Not legal theory, not constitutional interpretation, but how justice, real, tangible, everyday justice, seems to operate on two completely different tracks. And that's when it happened. Roberts's face changed. He leaned forward, and for the first time all morning, his voice lost its polish. It came out curt, harsh, defensive. Don't bring petty personal anecdotes into this chamber, he snapped. His words dropped like a hammer, one that didn't hit the table, but aimed straight at her dignity. This is the law, not your political stage. Gasps didn't fill the room, but the energy shifted hard. Several senators visibly recoiled. A reporter's pen stopped mid-sentence. One aide froze with her hand still hovering over a laptop keyboard. No one had expected that. But Jasmine, she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't even blink. Instead, she leaned in, slow and deliberate, like a woman walking into the center of the storm, not to survive it, but to command it. And then she said it. And it's because you treat everyday people like petty anecdotes that justice is in free fall. Her voice didn't crack. It cut, through silence, through decorum, through every layer of power wrapped in marble and procedure. People like Carla aren't props. They're the reason this chamber exists. They're the reason your robe has meaning. And when they get left behind, discarded because they don't have a political action committee backing them or a private jet, that's not justice. That's abandonment. Her tone dropped lower, firmer. This system wasn't made to be convenient for you. It was made to be accountable to them. And with that, the room detonated, without noise. It didn't need sound. The silence was the explosion. One senator muttered, "My God." Another leaned back like he'd just been winded. Across the room, a young aide whispered, "She said what everyone's been thinking for years." Even reporters, trained to remain detached, sat in stunned stillness, unsure if they were watching a hearing or history. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The Chief Justice's face was stone, but his eyes betrayed him, narrowed, unsettled, blinking too often. Jasmine, however, didn't shift. She didn't celebrate. She just sat there, centered and unwavering, like someone who had spent her entire life waiting for the moment someone in power would finally say what Roberts just had, so she could finally answer it. This wasn't just the second peak of the day, it was a reckoning, and the name Carla Jennings would never be dismissed again. And just when the room thought Jasmine had emptied her arsenal, she reached for something far more lethal than law. His own words, turned against him like a blade he forgot he once forged. She didn't fumble. She didn't hesitate. She knew exactly where it was. Jasmine's hand moved through the folder like it had done so 100 times before. Not for drama, but for precision. When she pulled out the page, it wasn't thick, wasn't loud, wasn't flashy. But what it contained was enough to shake the walls. The heading read, Harvard Law School Commencement Address, 2013. One page, one quote, one trap. She glanced up, not with aggression, but with surgical calm. "Chief Justice," she said, holding the document gently but firmly, "I believe these words may sound familiar." Then her voice steadied, and without a shred of irony, she read, "Credibility is your currency. Once you lose that, you've lost everything." The quote landed with the force of a bomb that made no sound but rattled every bone in the room. No one moved. No one breathed. It was the kind of line that once spoken couldn't be unsaid, and Roberts knew it. She wasn't quoting a critic. She wasn't reading from a headline. She was echoing his own voice, one he had used to inspire a room full of rising legal minds a decade ago. Now it came back like a ghost. Jasmine paused, just for a heartbeat. Then she locked eyes with him. "You said that," she continued, her voice neither mocking nor theatrical, just deadly honest. "You! That wasn't a courtroom speech. That wasn't written under pressure. That was a message you chose to give to the next generation of lawyers. And Chief Justice, I agree with you. Completely." The weight of that moment didn't need commentary, She had walked him into his own legacy, only to show him where it had collapsed. She placed the paper flat on the desk in front of her and leaned in, not with force, but with finality. "But here's the problem," she said, her voice tightening. "You said that. You defined the currency of the court. And today the institution you represent isn't just running low on credibility." She stopped, let the silence twist, and then, "It's in overdraft." The words hit like steel to glass. A full-body blow, silent, surgical, and irreversible. "You said credibility is the currency of the court," she pressed on, never breaking eye contact. "But if that's true, then the court is broke. Not just low on funds, not just struggling. I mean bankrupt, spiritually, morally, systemically bankrupt in the one thing that gave it meaning in the eyes of the American people." No one interrupted. No one dared. The gallery had turned to stone. Even the ambient sounds, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights, the quiet shifting of suits, the soft clicks of cameras, faded beneath her voice. "Public trust," she continued, "isn't slipping. It's gone. We're not talking about disillusionment. We're talking about collapse. People aren't asking whether your rulings are wrong. They're asking whether your court even knows what right looks like anymore." She wasn't yelling, but it felt louder than anything said all morning. Her tone dropped, lower, colder, truer. "When a single mother can't get a case reviewed, but a billionaire with ties to your colleagues can get theirs rushed through in weeks, when financial disclosures disappear, recusals are optional, and ethics are decided behind closed doors, how do you expect the people to believe anything coming from that bench matters?" Still no reply. Robert sat frozen, not paralyzed but unraveling. His face remained still, but his fingers now tightened slightly around the edge of the table. He'd been spoken to, questioned, even cornered before. But this wasn't cross-examination. This was exposure. And the weapon was his own philosophy, turned inward. "You said it, Chief Justice," Jasmine repeated, this time slower. "Credibility is your currency. Once you lose that—" She nodded slightly, voice firm and final. "You've lost everything." She didn't need to add anything else, because in that moment, no robe, no title, no legacy could protect him from the truth of what he once believed, but had long since stopped living by. And the courtroom, for the first time that day, didn't just see the Chief Justice under fire. They saw him in debt. A deficit not of dollars, but of honor. And Jasmine had just called the balance due. And just when the silence had stretched to its breaking point, Jasmine detonated the room. Not with fire, not with fury, but with facts that couldn't be denied, outrun, or spun. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't raise her voice. She just reached down calmly, like someone about to flip the final switch. From the bottom of her folder, she drew out a red-marked sleeve, slim, precise, and deadly in its simplicity. She slid it onto the desk like a closing argument, already carved in stone. And for the first time all morning, she didn't look at the committee. She didn't look at the cameras. She stared directly at Chief Justice John Roberts and said without flinching, "This is a leaked internal email from a private donor, one of the top political financiers in the country." The words sliced through the tension like a scalpel. The room didn't react yet, but it tightened, like lungs drawing in one last breath before impact. She continued, voice steady as concrete. "In this exchange, he outlines a scheduled phone call with a sitting Supreme Court justice." The word sitting didn't just land, it thudded. That call took place exactly 11 days before the court issued a decision on a case involving the donor's energy firm. Then she flipped the page, revealing the email header and message body under a projector glare. Bold font, time-stamped, authentic. Jasmine didn't need to read the whole thing, just the part that mattered. "Judges aligned. Call scheduled for 7:30 p.m. Tuesday. Wants to confirm we're comfortable with paragraph 3. Language around public impact may need softening. Use the phrasing we discussed, unintended consequence instead of foreseeable harm." The room didn't move, but something shifted. The temperature, the oxygen, the reality. Jasmine stared dead ahead and said, "That's not commentary. That's pre-ruling coordination. That's not advocacy. That's contamination of justice. She gave no space for rebuttal. The donor's former executive assistant verified the chain, she said, reaching for a second sheet, now bearing an official notary stamp. She signed an affidavit, dated and notarized. It confirms that this conversation was neither casual nor misunderstood. It was intentional, coordinated, pre-ruling. Still no one moved. But the oxygen in the room had changed. It was thicker, hotter, tighter. Then Jasmine delivered the next hit. Colder, cleaner, fatal. This, she said, now lifting a third page with both hands, is a financial transfer record. Her tone sharpened like the tip of a blade. It's from a Delaware-based shell company tied to the same donor. The name of the firm was underlined, the date circled, the amount in bold. The company received exactly $2.75 million just 3 weeks after the decision, she said, and we traced the funds. She turned the page one last time. The authorization came with a handwritten signature, she said flatly. Same donor, same justice's inner circle. She raised the final document. This is that signature. And in that moment, the floor fell out from under the entire chamber. There was no gasping, just raw, audible shock. Chairs shifted, phones went up, a pen dropped and clattered loudly enough to echo off the marble. Even the most stone-faced aides were visibly rattled. The reporters in the press gallery stopped typing, not to pause, but because they knew they had just witnessed the headline write itself. Across the long oak desk, Robert sat completely still. But his silence wasn't composed anymore. It was vacant. His fingers, previously folded with practiced calm, now curled against the wood like claws digging in for balance. His lips didn't press. They stretched, pale, tight, strained. Because this wasn't theory, it wasn't conjecture. This was paper, time-stamped, signed, traceable. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. She leaned forward slowly, her tone ice-cold, each word laced with precision. "So tell me, Chief Justice," she said, voice cutting through the tension like a verdict about to be delivered. "What's the exchange rate on integrity these days?" Dead silence. No response. Not even an attempt. Because how do you answer a question like that when the evidence is still on the table and the cameras are still rolling? No amount of robes, precedent, or titles could shield him now. The walls that had protected his institution for decades had cracked, and in those cracks, the world could see everything. This wasn't a revelation, it was a collapse. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't a prosecutor. She was the reckoning the system never saw coming. He opened his mouth, but nothing coherent came out. Just fragments. Just noise. His throat tightened as if even his body had decided this was the moment to betray him. I don't... These documents, this isn't," he muttered, grasping at words like lifelines that kept slipping through his fingers. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the stillness he was trying to project. A man once revered for control now couldn't control his own breath. Robert's voice, once smooth and ironclad, cracked with the pressure of his unraveling image. "These materials, I was never briefed," he stuttered, eyes flicking from the evidence on the table to the sea of silent eyes drilling into him. It wasn't just panic, it was erosion. The polished facade that had withstood decades of power was now flaking away under the heat of one woman's unwavering gaze. And that gaze belonged to Jasmine Crockett. She didn't flinch, didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't move a muscle. She simply waited. Waited for the moment when his power collapsed under its own weight. And when that moment came, when his excuses wilted into stammers, she leaned forward with the calm of a storm that had already made landfall. Her voice didn't echo. It didn't need to. It moved slow like the pulling of a trigger. "You once taught," she began, her tone smooth but cold, "that the truth doesn't need to shout." The pause was deliberate. She let the weight of his own words return to him like a mirror held steady. "So let your silence speak for you." The sentence hung in the air like a final verdict. No gavel needed. Roberts froze, his lips slightly parted, no words daring to come out. His pupils twitched. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the table. desperate to anchor himself to something, anything, that didn't feel like crumbling ground. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was punishing. No coughs, no whispers, not even a breath from the dozen aides and lawmakers in the room. The only sound that pierced through was the relentless mechanical clicking of cameras, reporters snapping the fall in real time, each flash like a public branding. One, after another, after another. From the press row, a journalist dropped his pen and didn't bother picking it up. On the far end of the chamber, a staffer's eyes were wide, frozen mid-blink. And behind Jasmine, a congressman who had earlier chuckled at her confidence now sat stone-faced, lips pressed shut, stunned into respect. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't have to. Her hands remained resting gently on the desk, her back straight, her eyes locked on the man who once spoke of dignity like scripture, and now couldn't speak at all. There was no applause. No need. The silence was louder than any standing ovation. Because in that moment, power didn't belong to the one with the title. It belonged to the one who still had the truth. And Roberts, despite every robe, every ruling, every ounce of legacy, had none left to hold. The sound of the last shutter faded, but the weight of silence remained like smoke after an explosion. No one dared move. Not after what had just unfolded. Roberts was frozen, unraveled, stripped of his title by something far more powerful than authority: truth. And in that breathless stillness, Jasmine took one deliberate step forward. Her body didn't shift in anger, but in purpose. She turned, slowly, methodically, toward the lens that had been trained on her the whole time. Her eyes found it, found them, not the senators, not the press, but the people, the real jury, the ones who had never been invited to this room, but who lived with the consequences of every word spoken inside it. Her voice didn't rise. It descended deeper, fuller, heavier, with every ounce of truth America had long buried under noise and power. She spoke not as a congresswoman, not as a prosecutor, but as a witness on behalf of those who never got to speak. Her lips parted, her eyes steady, and with the calm of a storm approaching, she delivered it. "If a single mother and a truck driver are left behind," she said, every word hitting like a gavel, "while the wealthy are hand-fed at every table, then that's not justice anymore." It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't rehearsed. It was a wound speaking back. The words didn't just fill the room. They cut through it, like a blade through marble. Staffers stopped typing. Reporters lowered their phones, stunned into stillness. For once, there were no whispers in the press gallery. There was no clever commentary, no side glances, no partisan chuckles, just eyes, wide, wet, and locked on Jasmine. A senator near the back leaned forward, hands clenched, caught somewhere between shame and revelation. The stenographer, a woman who had transcribed 1,000 meaningless rants, hesitated, hands trembling slightly above the keys. And in that hesitation was the weight of truth finally arriving, not with sirens, but with clarity. Jasmine didn't blink. Her voice didn't waver. She knew what she had just done. She didn't need to raise her voice to raise the stakes. The camera stayed trained on her, unmoving, as if even the lens was afraid to lose this moment. She had grabbed the soul of the nation with a sentence, and now it refused to let go. From the corner, one congressman quietly set down his pen. Another, a Republican from Kentucky, rubbed his forehead like he was trying to erase the past 10 minutes. Jasmine hadn't accused anyone by name, but everyone in the room felt named and guilty. Outside the chamber, Americans watching live didn't just hear her words, they recognized them. The mother working 3 jobs, the veteran denied care, the mechanic whose insurance lapsed after a missed paycheck, the families in rural towns and inner cities alike, wondering if the law had forgotten them. For the first time in years, someone didn't speak for them. She spoke as them. A woman near the front, dressed in a modest gray suit, clutched a worn notepad to her chest. Her eyes brimmed with tears, not because she was sad, but because someone finally said what she'd screamed in silence for years. Jasmine stood still, letting the words breathe. She didn't fill the space with more speeches. She let the silence speak for itself. And it did. Loudly. Behind the glass of the press room, one anchor leaned toward another and whispered, Did she just change the entire narrative? But even he didn't say it with sarcasm. He said it with awe, because what had happened wasn't political theater. It was moral clarity in a building that had forgotten how to host it. No charts, no slogans, no applause cues. Just one woman standing where power had lived too long without accountability, saying what the powerful had refused to admit. If a single mother and a truck driver are left behind, while the wealthy are hand-fed at every table, then that's not justice anymore. And suddenly justice didn't feel like a courtroom or a robe. It felt like her. The weight of her words created a vacuum. Roberts, still seated behind her, seemed like a faded shadow of what he once represented. His mouth moved, but nothing came out. No objection, no deflection, not even denial. Just breath, and barely that. Jasmine's silence had become the loudest voice in the room. The audience felt it too. Some stared at the ground, some at the ceiling, anywhere but each other. Because in that moment, they weren't senators or aides or reporters. They were Americans, witnesses. And for the first time, they were the ones on trial. Jasmine looked down for a second, collecting herself. But it wasn't because she was shaken. It was because she understood the weight of what she had just done. This wasn't a soundbite. This was a reckoning. She raised her head again, her gaze no longer fierce, but compassionate, tired, and clear. Like someone who had fought too long to get here. Someone who had been dismissed, insulted, underestimated, and still stood. Not for applause, not for revenge, but for something so basic it felt revolutionary again. Fairness. And in that truth, raw, undiluted, and utterly human, she reached people. Not just in the chamber, not just across party lines, but across the country, through screens, into hearts, into the conscience of a nation that had traded empathy for noise. Back in the gallery, someone sniffled. Another wiped their cheek. And still, no one clapped. Because this wasn't a victory lap. This was a mirror. And every single person, powerful or not, had just seen themselves in it. And just when the silence became unbearable, just when the chamber had no more room for noise, excuses, or spin, something unexpected happened. Not a shout, not a protest, just a voice, software fractured, coming from the man who once ruled this room like a sovereign king. Roberts exhaled slowly, almost like he'd aged a decade in the span of 10 minutes. The lines around his mouth had hardened into something hollow, something closer to defeat than reflection. He didn't look at Jasmine. He looked through her for a moment, like trying to find the version of himself that used to believe in the system, but that version was gone. Finally, he spoke, barely audible, yet cutting through the room like a confession in a church. "Your constituents are very lucky," he said, his voice rough, low, and nearly drowned by the stillness. It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't performative. It was real. It was the sound of a man who, for the first time, realized that power didn't make him right, that maybe it never had. The words dropped into the air like a cracked glass, quiet but undeniable. A few heads turned, others froze. Even the court officers in the shadows shifted their weight uncomfortably. They'd never heard Robert speak that way, not to anyone, and especially not to someone like Jasmine. Not to a woman who just dismantled his decades of untouchable arrogance with nothing more than precision and presence. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't gloat. She didn't even flinch. She just let the words land, absorb, and hang. And then, with a voice calm as a loaded gun, she responded. "I know," she said, her eyes locked on him like steel. "Because they sent me here to speak for them." It wasn't pride. It was purpose. The way she said it didn't just answer his compliment. It rewrote it. She wasn't here by chance. She wasn't here by favor. She was sent. And now he knew by whom. Not donors, not lobbyists, not judges, but people. Real ones. The kind Roberts hadn't looked in the eyes in years. The tension in the chamber snapped like a taut wire. No one knew what to do next. Clap? Speak? Move? Instead, all eyes turned to Roberts, once feared, now silent. His shoulders sank just slightly, a ripple in the armor of a man long untouchable. His eyes dropped to the polished mahogany desk in front of him, and in that small, unspoken moment, he became something he had never allowed himself to be: humbled. His fingers curled slightly around the edge of the desk, like he needed something to hold on to, anything, to keep from collapsing under the truth he had just admitted. The truth Jasmine had forced him to face without screaming, without begging, without even raising her voice. She had simply been undeniable. He stared at the grain of the wood like it held answers. But it didn't. Not this time. For once, the answers weren't in procedure, precedent, or power plays. They were in a woman standing across from him, telling him, without a flicker of apology, that the people mattered more than he did. And now, finally, he believed her. The room was still watching, still processing what had just happened. Because everyone understood something seismic had shifted. Jasmine hadn't just survived the moment. She'd owned it. She had walked into a storm built to swallow her whole, and instead made it kneel. And the man who once summoned fear with a glance now couldn't meet her eyes. Outside, the air in D.C. was thick with August heat, but inside that chamber the temperature had dropped. Not from cold, but from clarity. It was the kind of moment that didn't need commentary, the kind that didn't make headlines, but rewrote history anyway. Jasmine remained standing, straight, grounded, present, her arms at her sides, her eyes steady, not victorious but firm. She wasn't here for theatrics, she was here for justice, and the man who once mocked her presence now sat beneath it. Across the aisle, a younger staffer scribbled a note with a shaky hand. Another aide sent a text that simply read, "It's over." She flipped the room. No emojis, no hashtags, just the truth. Raw, undeniable, final. Back at the bench, Roberts still hadn't looked up. His face was different now, smaller somehow, less certain. The authority that once clung to every crease in his robe now pooled around him like excess weight. The kind you carry when you realize you've stopped listening too long ago. And Jasmine, she didn't rub it in. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply stood in the eye of what she had created, a courtroom turned confession booth, and all she had done was stand firm and tell the truth. In a side row, a seasoned reporter whispered, "That right there, that was the moment. That's what history books will replay." Because it wasn't the sound of Jasmine's words that shook the room. It was the sound of Roberts having nothing left to say. The camera crews adjusted their lenses, trying to catch the tremble in his hand, the way his lips pursed like someone tasting regret for the first time. There was no rage, no rebuttal, just a man slowly realizing that silence wasn't the absence of power. It was the beginning of accountability. Jasmine turned slightly, just enough to face the rest of the room. Her message had landed, not just with Roberts, but with all of them. The senators who looked down, the aides who suddenly seemed unsure of their notes, the gallery that no longer whispered. They'd seen something rare, truth win without needing to shout. And from the man who once made people tremble with just a glance, now all that remained was a bowed head. And when the bowed head finally lifted, the echo of that moment didn't stay in the chamber. It tore through the city, then the country, like a shockwave you could hear in your bones. The first blast hit the newsrooms. Editors barked orders, producers waved at camera ops, and lower thirds changed in real time. The clip of the exchange looped across every network. The sound cut to that brutal silence where truth did the talking. Push alerts stacked on phones like falling dominoes, each headline sharper than the last. Panel shows scrambled, anchors put on their breaking news voices, and live feeds glued themselves to the replay. It wasn't just coverage, it was a rupture. Then came the flood. Morning shows ran the segment at the top of the hour, noon broadcasts framed it as a national moment, and late-night hosts wrote monologues that needed no punchlines. Podcasts cut in mid-episode to record emergency takes. Talk radio lit up so fast the boards crackled with heat. Even the sports station did a minute on it, because some moments pushed past categories and forced themselves into every conversation in the country. But the real impact didn't live on sets or in studio lights. It landed in small, ordinary places where America actually breathes. Kitchen tables where bills are counted like prayers. Break rooms that smell like coffee and mop water. Truck stops at the edge of towns where diesel hangs in the air like fog. Laundromats where news plays on flickering TVs while quarters roll into metal mouths. Living rooms where couches sag under the same two people who have watched this government long enough to expect nothing and suddenly felt their chests lift. A single mother in Houston, still in scrubs from the night shift, stood in a parking lot with her phone propped on the hood of her car. She watched the clip twice, then a third time, arms folded tight against the August heat. It wasn't the questions that broke her. It was the line everyone tried to ignore until someone finally said it out loud. She didn't cry. She just nodded, jaw set, like a door inside her had been unlocked from the outside. On her lunch break, she texted the link to 3 coworkers and wrote 2 words. About time. On Interstate 80, a long-haul driver eased his rig to the shoulder and let the engine idle while the clip played through the cab speakers. The road hummed under his tires like a giant heart trying to steady itself. He thumbed the CB and said, "You boys hearing this?" The replies came back quick and stunned, some cautious, some relieved, none cynical. He downshifted, pulled back onto the highway, and for the first time in a long time, the white lines ahead didn't look like a sentence. They looked like a path. In a barber shop on the south side, the owner froze the clippers mid-fade while everyone stared at the TV. Nobody talked for a beat. Then someone said, "She didn't flinch," and the room nodded like a choir. In a union hall in Toledo, the volume edged up, and a room full of hard hats leaned in as if they were on the same job site. In a church basement in Birmingham, volunteers stacked pantry boxes while the audio thundered from a phone, and one woman whispered, "That's ministry," like she'd just watched a sermon preached in a different kind of sanctuary. Phones started ringing on Capitol Hill. Not angry, not frantic, just firm. "We watched," callers said. "We heard." Constituents who hadn't dialed a representative's number in 10 years left messages that were short, polite, impossible to ignore. At county courthouses, public defenders swapped the clip like a rallying cry, pausing long enough to memorize the cadence of the calm that cut through marble. Even in municipal courtrooms, bailiffs felt the shift. Jurors sat up straighter, and local judges measured their words like each one had a weight they could feel. The wave rolled into the law schools overnight. Deans fired off campus-wide emails announcing an emergency forum on judicial ethics, and the subject lines looked like they had been written with a fist. Professors scrapped lectures to build case studies around what the nation had just seen. Syllabi that once tucked appearance of impropriety into footnotes dragged it into the spotlight. The ethics course that used to fill half a room now had students standing in the hall. Office hours turned into confessionals where law students asked the question no textbook ever answers. What does doing the right thing actually cost? By evening, moot court teams were ripping apart their practice scripts. They restaged the exchange beat for beat, testing how you hold a room when the truth is louder than your voice. They weren't mimicking attitude. They were studying control. How to pace a question so it lands like a verdict. How to use silence like a hammer. How to make evidence do the speaking while power runs out of words. In clinics and legal aid offices, interns looked at intake stacks with different eyes. Pro bono sign-up sheets filled in ink so dark it bled through the page. Career counselors saw the tide turn in whispers. "I can't do mergers this summer. I need trial time." "I thought I wanted securities, but I want to stand up and say something that matters." It wasn't a trend. It was hunger reawakened. The young lawyers felt it like thunder in their group chats. Associates at big firms paused late-night billing to watch the clip twice before writing to their mentors. "This is why I took the bar." They screen-capped the moment the room fell silent and taped it to their monitors, right above the stack of documents that used to feel like the point. Partners who had spent years coaching, poise rewrote the lesson overnight. Poise means nothing if you never use it to protect the right person at the right time. In faculty lounges, the scholars put down their coffee and reached for chalk. Notes covered whiteboards like battle maps, disclosure regimes, recusal triggers, the moral physics of trust. Journals started planning special issues on accountability before lunch. By sunset, a dozen think tanks had booked roundtables, and symposium invites hit inboxes with subject lines that read like alarms. The language was careful, academic, responsible, and still you could feel the pulse. Something had been shaken loose. They started naming it because that's what the Academy does when it wants to keep a thing alive. Some called it the Crockett Standard, the expectation that officials must act not only beyond conflict, but beyond the appearance of it. Others called it the Crockett Test. If ordinary people think the process looks rigged, the process is already failing. A few pushed back, as they always will, but even the critics had to speak in the new light. You can argue with style. You can't argue with a nation hearing itself breathe again. And make no mistake, people breathed. Not like a cheer, like relief, like someone had opened a window in a room that had been locked for too long. It didn't turn cynics into believers or erase every bruise on the system, but the needle moved from why bother toward maybe if we push. Trust didn't come roaring back in a parade. It walked in quietly, sat down and said, "Prove it." A high school civics class in Phoenix streamed the clip on a battered projector and sat in a hush that teachers fight their whole careers to build. The teacher didn't lecture. She asked one question. "What did you hear?" A student in the back raised his hand and said, "That the truth is still bigger than power if someone will carry it." In a law library in Boston, two first-years flipped open case books and whispered, "This is what it's supposed to feel like." On a campus green in Madison, flyers went up for a student-led forum titled, "The People in the Room." Meanwhile, in living rooms across towns that never make the news, quiet agreements were made. A dad with calloused hands decided to serve jury duty without ducking the summons this time. A grandmother who'd sworn off voting wrote the date of the next election on the calendar again. An EMT on her second shift clicked "Submit" on a community board application she left half-finished for a year. Tiny choices, heavy consequences, signs that faith doesn't need fireworks to return. It needs proof you're still willing to fight for it. The press kept pounding the angle, but the country had already moved a step beyond the headlines. It wasn't about the spectacle anymore. It was about the standard. Law faculties debated reforms with the urgency of triage doctors. Bar associations slid emergency ethics sessions onto their conference schedules. Judicial clerks traded notes on disclosure norms the way pilots trade weather. Quietly, professionally, with the understanding that one bad call can cost lives. And through it all, one image kept replaying. A woman refusing to be moved, not because she was stubborn, but because the ground she chose to stand on was finally, undeniably, the right ground. Young lawyers clipped that still frame and set it as their phone background. Professors played that line in class and then let the silence do the grading. Deans asked commencement speakers a different question this year. Don't tell them what law is. Tell them who it's for. In corner offices and cramped cubicles, in lecture halls and church basements, the same realization took root. Courage is contagious when it's quiet and clean. No grandstanding, no theatrics, just the steady hand of someone who knows the difference between a spotlight and a searchlight, and chooses the latter. That's why it spread. Not because it was flashy, because it was true. By week's end, you could feel the shift without turning on a screen. The country's pulse had steadied, not healed, steady, not naive, awake. People still argued, they always will. But the argument had new terms: fairness up front, sunlight on the process, consequences that stick. You could hear it in diners, on loading docks, outside courthouses where families still hold their breath under hard fluorescent lights. And in the halls where the next generation learns to speak for a living, a new oath formed, unwritten but understood. They didn't say they wanted to be famous. They didn't say they wanted to win. They said they wanted that. The moment when a room bends toward truth and stays there because someone refused to let it slip away. They didn't call her perfect. They called her necessary. So yes, the headlines blazed and the panels argued and the clips racked up numbers like a championship run. But the bigger story walked quieter, deeper, truer, through classrooms and clinics, kitchens and cabs. Ordinary people felt a small light turn on where it had been dim for too long. Law schools felt their spine again. Young attorneys felt their purpose harden like steel cooled in water. And in all those places, from the newsroom to the night shift, one idea kept repeating like a heartbeat. Justice is only as strong as the people who insist on seeing it with their own eyes. That day they saw it, and once you see it, you don't go back to the dark. And when the last echo of that chamber faded, the story didn't die. It detonated outward, racing past the marble walls and microphones until it was humming in America's bloodstream. It began as a clip shared online, then grew into a firestorm. Airport lounges fell silent while travelers leaned toward muted TVs, reading captions word for word. Group chats buzzed with links flying across factory floors, farmhouses, city buses, and kitchen tables. Nobody wanted summaries. They wanted the raw moment, the uncut exchange where silence proved louder than power. By nightfall, the hearing had escaped Washington. It was everywhere. Front porches where neighbors usually swapped gossip now carried one sentence repeated like scripture. In union halls, the replay lit up a projector screen, while men and women in work boots nodded like jurors. In small diners, forks froze midair as televisions replayed the look on Roberts' face. Even churches wove it into Sunday discussions, not as politics, but as parable, courage against power. The story had leapt the boundaries of law and settled into the soil of everyday life. Behind the closed doors of courthouses, judges felt the tremor. Clerks whispered about the time-stamped moment courage overtook protocol. Public defenders streamed the clip on lunch breaks, their backs a little straighter as they walked into hearings. Even in the highest chambers, where marble usually insulated ego, there was no denying the shift. No one, not even the Supreme Court, stood above justice. The reaction wasn't rage, it was recognition. Letters poured into offices, not dripping with adjectives, but sharp and clean. "Trust wants receipts," one headline declared, and the phrase spread like wildfire. People weren't screaming, they were demanding. And demand, steady and relentless, has always been more dangerous than noise. The tremor stretched across small towns and big cities alike. On a salmon boat in Alaska, men in rubber boots nodded at the audio playing from a weathered speaker. A nurse in New York propped a phone between charts and sanitizer, whispering, "Finally." A farmer in Kansas at dawn muttered to the empty horizon, "That's the job." A librarian in Louisiana built a display called "We the People," half case law, half courage. From coast to coast, the clip was no longer news. It was a mirror. Law schools changed overnight. Deans revised notes. Professors asked students what accountability meant when power forgot its limits, and moot courts stopped focusing on theatrics, opting instead for timing, precision, and moral weight. A sign appeared in one legal clinic. "Justice is a verb." Students carried it forward like a motto carved into their work. Young lawyers gathered in break rooms, eyes lit by laptop screens, and swore this was the standard they would practice under. Even associates in polished firms paused their billable hours and whispered, "The job has a center again." Media, of course, spun panels and podcasts, but the deeper current was quieter, more serious. People realized the story wasn't a spectacle, it was permission. Permission to ask sharper questions at local meetings, to demand explanations in plain language, to file records requests without apology. A mother attending a school board meeting no longer felt like an intruder. She felt like a citizen. A city clerk double-checked a form and called to confirm because she understood small mistakes carried human weight. The ripple effect wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. The clips spread because good stories always pay rent to the truth. This one did. It entered factories during shift changes, living rooms during dinner, porches at dusk, and glove compartments during midnight drives. And everywhere it landed, the same conclusion rang clear. No one, not even the Supreme Court, was above justice. Parents showed their children the replay, not as politics, but as proof. "Listen," one father told his daughter, "to the part where the truth didn't need to shout." Teachers used the transcript as a debate exercise, letting students direct the room. Coaches told their teams that leadership sometimes sounds like silence that refuses to back down. Pastors reminded congregations that fairness isn't decoration, it's obligation. The lesson became less about law and more about life. Even businesses, often numb to politics, shifted uncomfortably in the mirror. Boards asked what appearance really meant when trust was the currency they couldn't print. Compliance officers rewrote memos with plainer words. HR departments pinned a new line in handbooks. We choose sunlight. For once, it wasn't marketing, it was survival. No room wanted to be caught on the wrong side of a standard everyone could now see. The lesson was brutally simple. Justice is not a robe and not a chair. It is not the echo of polished shoes in a marble hallway or a nameplate on a heavy desk. It is not insulation or tradition or secrecy. It is a heartbeat paired with courage, carried into rooms by those willing to risk silence breaking against them. It is the oldest truth, wearing new armor, transparency and accountability, and you could watch that truth ripple into daily choices. A juror demanded a line be read twice, not once. A city council vote stretched late because citizens refused to leave until the numbers were explained. A young attorney in a crowded public defender's office stayed an extra hour to prepare, whispering Jasmine's words like a mantra. And a county judge paused before the docket, realizing every case name carried a human life, and that pause made all the difference. The story didn't close with applause. It opened doors. It walked into town halls and volunteer shifts, into signatures written by hands that had never signed petitions before. It wrote in folding chairs carried into crowded meetings and in long emails typed at midnight by citizens who didn't know they had a voice until now. It gave ordinary people the permission to sit in the front row and refuse to move. So the fire spread, but it didn't destroy. It clarified. It didn't burn down the house. It burned away the fog so people could see the front door again. It warned the marble that if it doesn't serve the people, it serves no one. It reminded America that silence can be either a shield or a verdict, depending on who controls it. And it left the people with the most powerful weapon a democracy can ever hand down, a line drawn straight and sharp. No one, not a donor, not a bench, not even the Supreme Court, stands above justice. And the final lesson is heavy enough to last. Justice is not a robe. It is not a chair. It is the truth and the courage to speak it. And when the echoes of that lesson stopped reverberating through the marble halls, one truth remained hanging in the air like smoke after an explosion. A story like this can't just be watched. It demands an answer. It demands action. Justice is not a spectator sport. It's not something you cheer for once and forget by morning. Justice is a fight that renews itself every single day, in every city council meeting, every courthouse hallway, every ballot box, every question asked by an ordinary citizen who refuses to stay silent. If people like Jasmine Crockett could stand eye to eye with the highest seat in the land, then what excuse do the rest of us have? The time for watching is over. The time for moving is now. So here is the call. Don't let this moment die on a replay. Carry it, spread it, live it. If you've ever felt small in the face of power, remember how silence was shattered in that hearing room. If you've ever wondered whether your voice matters, let this answer it. Yes, it does. Speak it at your workplace, at your church, in your classroom, on your street corner. Speak it even if your voice shakes, because the people who profit from silence are counting on you to stay quiet. Look around. Change doesn't begin in courts. It begins at kitchen tables, in living rooms, on sidewalks where neighbors refuse to be ignored. Volunteer for causes that protect fairness. Support leaders who prove they serve people, not privilege. Hold your institutions accountable with questions they cannot dodge. And when they try to dismiss you, remember Jasmine's words. You can put me down, but you cannot put down the truth. Let that line be your shield. Let it be your weapon. This is not just about politics. It's about dignity. It's about reminding every Carla Jennings, every Jorge Salgado, every unseen name in the shadows that they are not invisible. It's about making sure their stories don't end at a closed courtroom door. The power to protect that truth doesn't belong to robes or titles. It belongs to you, and you don't need permission to use it. So rise, ask harder questions, demand fairer answers, push back when they say, that's just how it works. Because if ordinary people stay silent, then power wins by default. But when ordinary people speak with one voice, steady, clear, relentless, power doesn't just tremble, it kneels. The moment you just witnessed was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a movement. Now it's your turn. Carry the truth forward. Keep it alive. And never, ever forget, no one, not even the Supreme Court, stands above justice. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.